I still remember the sound that finally snapped something in me. Tires tearing across my front lawn at 6:30 in the morning, grinding through the grass like it was bare asphalt. I froze at the kitchen window and watched the HOA president's SUV cut diagonally across my yard again. Same path, same speed. No hesitation. Like the property line didn't exist, and neither did I. By then, I'd already done everything the right way. I'd sent polite emails. I'd made phone calls. I'd filed formal complaints. Somehow, I was the one who ended up fined, accused of interfering with HOA operations. Standing there with my coffee going cold, it finally hit me. This had nothing to do with convenience or a shortcut. This was about control, about reminding me who she thought was in charge. Her name was Linda Carver, president of the HOA in Maple Glen Estates, a quiet little neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio. On paper, she was supposed to protect homeowners. In reality, she treated the HOA like her personal kingdom, and anyone who questioned her paid for it. That morning, I didn't storm outside. I didn't confront her. I just stood there, watched carefully, and started planning. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I need to explain why this mattered so much, because from the outside, it probably sounds small, even petty. It wasn't. My wife and I bought our home in Maple Glen Estates almost 15 years ago, back when life felt simpler and plans still stretched far into the future. I'm Mark Reynolds, mid-50s, semi-retired, the kind of person who believes that if you take care of something long enough, it takes care of you back. For me, that something was our home, and especially the yard. It wasn't just grass. It was the one piece of my life I could still shape, maintain, and control as everything else slowly became harder. Over the years, my world had shrunk in ways I didn't expect. Retirement wasn't the relaxing victory lap people make it out to be. Medical bills arrived more often than vacation brochures, and Elaine, my wife, started dealing with health issues that kept her home most days. The house became our entire universe. The lawn out front was our quiet pride. The first thing people saw, the last thing I worked on before sunset, the place where I felt useful and steady when everything else felt uncertain. Linda Carver became HOA president about a year before the trouble started. At first, I'll admit, she seemed fine, efficient, organized. She talked a lot about raising standards and protecting property values, and most people nodded along. I did too. But it didn't take long before those standards started applying differently depending on who you were. Small things changed first. One neighbor got cited for a trash bin left out an hour too long. Another was fined for the wrong shade of beige on a fence that had been there for years. Meanwhile, Linda's own place somehow never seemed to violate anything. The rules didn't disappear. They just bent. Then her SUV started cutting across my corner lot. At first, I honestly thought it was a mistake. Our property sits near the clubhouse, and if you're in a hurry, my lawn shaves off a few seconds compared to driving all the way around. The first time it happened, I shrugged it off. The second time, I frowned. By the fifth time, I knew it wasn't accidental anymore. I tried to handle it the adult way. I knocked on Linda's door one afternoon and politely asked if she could stop driving across my lawn. She smiled, said she didn't realize it was an issue, and assured me it wouldn't happen again. The next morning, her tire tracks were fresh in the grass, so I sent an email. Calm, respectful, clear. She replied with a short message thanking me for bringing it to her attention. That afternoon, the tracks were back. Then the letters started showing up in my mailbox. Official HOA notices. Stiff language. Bold headings. They claimed my lawn showed excessive wear and didn't meet appearance standards. I remember laughing out loud the first time I read one because the cause of that wear was literally the HOA president using it as a driveway. But the laughter didn't last long. The fines came quickly after that. Modest at first, then higher. Late fees attached even when payments were sent on time. Any attempt to dispute them was met with vague responses about HOA authority and operational necessity. Elaine saw every letter before I could hide it. Every envelope tightened her shoulders. Every fine made her anxious. She worried about money, about stress, about what would happen if the HOA escalated things further. Watching her sit at the kitchen table, rereading the same notices with that quiet look of fear in her eyes, changed how this felt for me. This wasn't just an annoyance anymore. It was an intrusion into our peace. I went to one HOA meeting hoping reason would win out. I laid out the situation calmly, explained that the damage to my lawn was coming from repeated trespass, and asked for a simple solution. Linda listened with that same polite smile, then reframed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't a homeowner protecting his property. I was hostile, uncooperative, and disruptive to HOA operations. The room went quiet. No one backed me up. People stared at their laps like they hadn't heard a word. That night, Elaine asked me a question that stuck with me. She said, "What if arguing with her is exactly what she wants?" I didn't have an answer right away, but I realized something important in that moment. Every time I complained, Linda tightened her grip. Every time I reacted emotionally, she gained another excuse to punish me. The rules weren't broken, they were being used. And the only way to beat someone who weaponizes authority isn't to shout louder. It's to stop feeding them. That was when I decided to stop asking for fairness and start paying attention instead. Things escalated almost immediately after I tried what I thought was the most harmless solution possible. I didn't install a fence. I didn't pour concrete or block access. I bought a simple decorative rope, the kind you see around flower beds, and placed it along the edge of my lawn with a few wooden stakes. It was subtle, polite, and temporary. Just a visual reminder that the space wasn't a road. Less than 24 hours later, I got cited. An official HOA violation notice appeared on my door, accusing me of installing unauthorized structures that posed a safety concern. Linda herself brought it over. She didn't knock. She just slipped it into the doorframe and waited until I opened the door so she could smile at me while explaining it. That smile stuck with me. Tight, practiced, almost pleased, like she'd been waiting for the excuse. I took the rope down the same day. It didn't matter. The fines started stacking up after that. Fees for things I'd never been warned about. Charges marked late even though I paid them early. When I asked for clarification, the responses were vague and cold, buried in legal-sounding language that always ended with the same phrase, HOA operational authority. And then the contractors started using my lawn too. Delivery trucks, maintenance vans. People servicing the clubhouse began cutting across my property like it was officially designated overflow access. I stood in my driveway one afternoon, watching tire after tire carve deeper ruts into the grass I'd spent years caring for. When I emailed Linda about it, her response was a single sentence: temporary HOA necessity. Temporary turned into routine. Elaine stopped sitting near the front window. She said it made her anxious watching strangers drive so close to the house. Every time an envelope from the HOA arrived, she'd flinch before opening it, like she already knew it wouldn't be good. I tried to shield her from it, but stress has a way of leaking through walls. Our home, the place that was supposed to be calm and safe, started feeling monitored. I decided to attend another HOA meeting, thinking that maybe speaking face-to-face, calmly and clearly, would force some accountability. I prepared notes, dates, facts. I told myself I'd stay composed no matter what. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes for me. Linda controlled the agenda like a stage director. When my turn came, she let me speak just long enough to sound emotional, then cut in smoothly. She reframed everything. According to her, I wasn't a homeowner defending private property. I was someone interfering with HOA operations, creating conflict, and disrupting community harmony. She used those exact words. Harmony. As if my lawn was the problem, not the repeated trespass. I tried to respond, but she shut me down again, reminding me that homeowner comments were time-limited. The board nodded along. No one challenged her. Neighbors avoided eye contact. A few people I'd known for years suddenly found the floor very interesting. That was the moment I understood the real weapon she was using. It wasn't fines. It wasn't rules. It was fear. No one wanted to be next. No one wanted the attention. It was easier to stay quiet and let someone else absorb the pressure. Watching that room full of people shrink into silence hurt more than the fines ever did. That night, Elaine and I sat at the kitchen table in near silence. The house felt heavy. She finally looked at me and asked, very softly, "What happens if we just stop arguing with her?" I started to answer, then stopped. She wasn't finished. "What if we stop reacting," she said, "and just watch?" That question hit harder than anything Linda had done. Because Elaine was right. Every confrontation fed Linda exactly what she wanted. Emotion, conflict, proof that she could push and get a response. Every complaint gave her another opportunity to assert authority. I realized then that nothing I said would ever matter to her. The rules weren't broken by accident. They were being bent on purpose. And arguing inside a system designed to protect the person abusing it was pointless. So I stopped. I didn't send another email. I didn't attend another meeting. I didn't complain when trucks crossed my lawn. On the surface, it probably looked like I'd given up. In reality, I was paying closer attention than ever. I started noticing patterns. The exact angle Linda's SUV took every time. The spot where the tires hit first. The times of day it happened most often. I wrote things down quietly, without emotion. Dates, times, details. For the first time in months I felt calm. Not because the problem was gone, but because I finally understood it. And once you understand how someone operates, you don't need to fight them head on. You just need to let them keep doing exactly what they've always done, long enough for it to matter. I stopped complaining completely. No more emails, no more meetings, no more signs or barriers. On the surface, it probably looked like I'd accepted it. Like, I'd finally learned my place. But what I actually did was switch gears. Instead of reacting, I started documenting. Every morning, I walked the edge of my lawn with a notebook in my hand. I wrote down dates, times, weather conditions, how fresh the tire marks were, how deep the ruts sank into the soil. I took photos from the same angle each time, so there was no question what had changed. I measured the damage instead of describing it. I treated the lawn like a crime scene, not a personal insult. What stood out almost immediately was how predictable Linda was. She didn't vary her route, ever. She cut across my yard at the same angle, hit the same corner, and rolled over the same soft patch near my sprinkler valve every single time. The damage wasn't random. It was mechanical. Repeated stress in the same place. Once I noticed that, I couldn't unsee it. That predictability calmed me in a strange way. Engineers talk about systems behaving the same way under the same conditions. Linda wasn't improvising. She was operating on habit and entitlement. And habits leave patterns. A few days into this, my neighbor Tom Wheeler wandered over while I was taking pictures. Tom is a retired insurance adjuster, the kind of guy who notices details other people miss. He didn't ask many questions. He just watched for a moment, nodded, and said, "You're doing this the right way now." Tom offered to help. He set up a small, clearly visible camera on his own property, angled toward the street and the edge of my lawn. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't spying. It just watched my property line and whatever crossed it. He even explained that visibility mattered. Hidden cameras invite arguments. Visible ones shut them down. While I quietly gathered evidence, Linda did the opposite. She got bolder. Without any pushback from me, she seemed to take my silence as permission. HOA emails started going out about community events at the clubhouse, barbecues, fundraisers, meetings scheduled at odd hours. Every one of them conveniently increased traffic near my lot. One afternoon, I overheard her joking at a meeting I wasn't even attending. Tom told me later about how my lawn was finally getting some use. People laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughing was safer than objecting. That comment stuck with me. Not because it was insulting, but because it was revealing. She wasn't hiding anymore. In her mind, my property had already stopped being mine. Elaine noticed the change in me before anyone else did. I wasn't pacing anymore. I wasn't snapping at small things. I was calm in a way I hadn't been in months. She asked me once what I was thinking, and I told her the truth. She's not going to stop, I said, but she doesn't need to. Because the more Linda crossed my lawn, the stronger the record became. Each tire track wasn't just damage, it was evidence. Each day she repeated the behavior, she made the case cleaner, clearer, harder to explain away. The camera caught everything, the dates lined up, the patterns matched. And best of all, nothing I did could be framed as emotional or hostile. I wasn't interfering, I wasn't confronting, I wasn't escalating. I was letting her operate exactly the way she always had, just long enough for it to matter. That was the turning point. Not when I fought back, but when I stopped fighting at all. Because people like Linda don't self-correct. They don't reflect. They only stop when the system they're abusing finally turns and looks at them. And I was quietly making sure that when that moment came, there would be no confusion about who crossed the line and how many times she'd done it. The plan was never about revenge. I didn't want to embarrass anyone or win some dramatic showdown. I just wanted the behavior to stop, permanently, in a way that couldn't be twisted, dismissed, or reframed as me being difficult. Linda was too good at spinning stories. If there was going to be an end to this, it had to be clean, undeniable, and boring in the best possible way. Tom helped me see that clearly. Sitting on his back porch one evening, we went over what I'd collected so far. Photos, video clips, dates, measurements. He leaned back in his chair and said something that stuck with me. This isn't about how angry you are. It's about how consistent she is. He explained that insurance cases don't fall apart because of missing emotion. They fall apart because of missing patterns. And in my case, the pattern was perfect. Same vehicle, same route, same damage, same homeowner, over and over again. Linda had unknowingly handed me all three things that matter most when situations like this get serious: evidence, witnesses, and predictability. To make sure I wasn't missing anything, I scheduled a consultation with a local attorney named Rachel Monroe. I walked into her office with a folder that probably weighed more than it should have. She didn't react emotionally to anything I showed her. She just reviewed it carefully, asked a few quiet questions, and nodded. When she finished, she told me something simple but important. Repeated trespass documented over time changes the entire legal landscape. One incident can be explained away. Two can be argued. Dozens, backed by clear documentation and third-party witnesses, can't. And when the person doing it is an HOA officer abusing authority, the consequences multiply. Rachel also made one thing very clear. Whatever I did next had to stay within the law. No traps meant to cause harm, no confrontations, no actions that could be spun as provocation. If I stayed calm and clean, Linda wouldn't just lose the argument, she'd lose control of the narrative. Not long after that meeting, Linda announced a major community fundraiser at the clubhouse. It was one of her favorite types of events, public-facing, image-focused, and heavy on appearances. There were going to be vendors, guests from outside the neighborhood, and even a couple of local reporters covering it as a feel-good community piece. And, just like always, the logistics quietly routed overflow parking straight past my corner lot. I didn't protest. I didn't email the board. I didn't object at a meeting. On paper, I was cooperative, silent, compliant. Instead, I prepared. The key was that predictability. Linda didn't improvise. She drove the same way every time because she believed she could. She believed nothing would ever interrupt that routine, and that belief was the real vulnerability. With Tom's help, I positioned one small, legal, completely non-harmful obstacle right where Linda's front tire always landed. It wasn't hidden in a way that violated any rules. It didn't pose a risk to anyone walking or driving on the street, and it didn't affect any vehicle that stayed where it was supposed to be. It only existed on my property. I didn't tell Elaine the details. I didn't want her anxious. I just told her that soon, things would change. She trusted me, not because she knew the plan, but because she could feel that something was different. I wasn't tense anymore. I wasn't angry. I was steady. The night before the fundraiser, I stood at the window and looked out at the lawn. Freshly cut. Quiet. Ordinary. It looked exactly the way it always had, which was perfect. Because the next morning, Linda was going to do what she always did. And this time, the system she'd been abusing was finally going to notice. The morning of the event arrived clear and bright, the kind of day Linda loved for putting on a show. Cars started lining the street earlier than usual. Neighbors I hadn't seen in weeks were suddenly outside, dressed nicely, chatting like nothing had ever been wrong. Vendors unloaded tables near the clubhouse. Someone set up balloons. From the outside, Maple Glen Estates looked exactly the way Linda always wanted it to look. Cheerful, orderly, impressive. Linda arrived early, of course. She always did. Her SUV rolled down the street slow and confident, like she owned every inch of it. She waved at people, smiled broadly, played the part perfectly. This was her element, an audience, a spotlight, and a narrative she controlled. She didn't look toward my porch. She didn't notice the camera on Tom's property, clearly visible and pointed toward the street. She didn't notice the neighbors who had drifted closer, curious but quiet. And she certainly didn't notice me standing there, hands in my pockets, watching calmly. Her SUV turned the way it always did. The front tire crossed the property line. The suspension dipped slightly as it hit the soft patch of lawn she'd created over months of use. Everything followed the same routine, until it didn't. The vehicle stopped. Not with a crash, not with a jolt. Just a sudden, unnatural halt, like the ground itself had decided enough was enough. For a moment, no one spoke. The chatter from the sidewalk faded. A vendor stopped mid-sentence. Even the birds seemed to quiet. Linda pressed the accelerator once, then again, clearly confused. The tires spun uselessly. The SUV didn't move. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, public. Linda threw the door open and stepped out, her smile gone instantly. Her face flushed red as she looked around, searching for someone to blame. Her eyes landed on me. "What did you do?" she demanded, loud enough for half the block to hear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step forward. I stayed exactly where I was. "I didn't do anything," I said calmly. "Your vehicle is on my property." She scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "This is HOA access. We've been over this." I shook my head. "No, Linda, it isn't. And we haven't." People were watching now. Neighbors. Guests. Even a reporter holding a notepad a few steps back, eyes flicking between us. I continued, still calm. "This is private property. You've driven across it repeatedly for months. It's been documented. Today just happens to be the day it didn't work out." Her voice rose immediately. She accused me of sabotage, of harassment, of interfering with HOA operations, the same phrases she'd used against me so many times before. But this time, they didn't land the same way. Not out here. Not in front of witnesses. Tom stepped closer, not saying a word, just standing where the camera could see him clearly. A couple of neighbors murmured to each other. Someone asked quietly, "Is that really his lawn?" Linda tried to reposition the story, claiming an emergency route, claiming implied permission, claiming authority. But every claim fell flat against one simple fact. Her SUV was sitting squarely on my grass. Eventually, someone called the police. Not angrily, not dramatically, just matter-of-factly. The kind of call that changes the tone of everything. When the officers arrived, they didn't rush. They asked questions. They looked at property lines. They reviewed the footage Tom offered without comment. They listened while Linda talked over herself, her explanations growing more frantic and less consistent by the minute. I answered questions simply. Dates, times, facts, no accusations, no emotion. The officers exchanged a look that told me everything. Linda wasn't in charge anymore. By the time they asked her to move away from the vehicle and wait, the event behind us had stalled completely. Guests stood awkwardly. Vendors packed things back into boxes. The fundraiser that was supposed to make Linda look good had frozen in place around her immobilized SUV. I felt something unexpected then. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but relief. Deep, steady relief. For the first time in months, the situation wasn't being decided by who talked louder or who held a title. It was being decided by what actually happened. And for once, everyone could see it. Once the first police car pulled up, everything Linda had built around herself started to crack. Not all at once, more like a slow collapse, the kind where you can hear each support giving way. The officers didn't treat it like a spectacle. They treated it like a situation that needed facts. And facts were the one thing Linda had never prepared for. She tried to take control immediately. She spoke fast, talked over questions, waved her hands toward the clubhouse as if authority could be pointed at. Every sentence started with, "as HOA president," and ended with an excuse. Emergency access. Implied permission. Community benefit. Each explanation contradicted the one before it. One officer finally held up a hand and asked her to slow down. Then they turned to me. I handed over the documentation, not dramatically, not triumphantly, just a folder thick with dates, photos, and notes. Tom provided the footage. Clean angles, clear timestamps, repetition that couldn't be brushed off as coincidence. The officers watched quietly, occasionally asking a clarifying question, occasionally pausing the video to look closer at the tire path. Linda stood a few steps away, arms crossed tightly, her confidence draining by the minute. As the review went on, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began to speak up. At first it was hesitant. A man from 3 houses down mentioned a fine he'd never understood. A woman near the cul-de-sac talked about being cited for repairs she hadn't been given time to make. Another neighbor admitted that contractors had crossed his yard too. He just hadn't wanted the trouble of complaining. Once the first person spoke, the rest followed. The fear that had kept everyone quiet didn't vanish, but it weakened. Story after story painted the same picture: selective enforcement, intimidation, and rules that somehow only mattered when Linda decided they did. The HOA board members arrived next, alerted by the stalled event and the gathering crowd. They looked rattled. No clipboards. No prepared statements. Just confusion. They asked Linda what was going on, and she snapped at them, clearly frustrated that they weren't backing her the way they usually did. That reaction was the final shift. The board asked to see the footage. They asked about the fines. They asked about the complaints that had never made it into official records. Linda tried to dismiss it all as misunderstandings, but the volume of evidence made that impossible. By mid-afternoon, the fundraiser was effectively dead. Vendors packed up. Guests drifted away. The reporters didn't. They lingered, scribbling notes, filming the immobilized SUV, capturing the awkward standoff that had replaced Linda's carefully curated event. The board pulled Linda aside for a private discussion. It didn't stay private for long. Voices rose. Someone said the words, "liability exposure," loud enough for half the street to hear. When they came back, the decision was brief and devastating. Linda was suspended as HOA president pending a full investigation into abuse of authority and improper enforcement. Effective immediately. Her access to HOA communications and funds was frozen. Another board member was named interim chair. Linda stood there stunned, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. For the first time since I'd known her, she had no procedural language left to hide behind. The police issued a formal trespass warning. The SUV was eventually towed, slowly, carefully, and in full view of the cameras. It took nearly an hour, and every minute felt symbolic. As the tow truck pulled away, the crowd thinned, but the atmosphere had changed completely. People talked openly now. Quiet jokes were exchanged. Neighbors who hadn't acknowledged me in months nodded as they passed. The press stayed long enough to get statements from the board and a few homeowners. No one shouted. No one gloated. There was nothing dramatic to add. The truth was enough. By the time the street returned to normal, Linda's authority was gone. Not challenged. Not debated. Gone. And standing there in the quiet that followed, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my lawn anymore. It never really had been. It was about what happens when power finally runs into proof and can't talk its way out. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected, mostly because once it started, it didn't have to dig very far. What began as a review of repeated trespass quickly expanded into something much bigger. The interim HOA board hired an outside firm to look into enforcement records, fine histories, and complaint logs. And once those records were laid out side by side, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Linda hadn't just overstepped with me. She had enforced rules selectively, issuing violations to some homeowners while quietly overlooking identical issues at others. Fines had been issued without proper notice. Appeals had been logged and then quietly dismissed without review. In several cases, payments had been marked late despite being received on time, triggering unnecessary penalties. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together, it painted a clear picture of authority being used as leverage rather than responsibility. Linda resigned before the board could formally vote to remove her. The letter was short, carefully worded, and took no responsibility for anything. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Once she stepped down, the investigation continued without obstruction, and the findings were shared with the community in a way that had never happened before. For the first time, homeowners were allowed to see exactly how decisions had been made. The HOA refunded fines that had been improperly issued, including every dollar I'd paid over the previous months. More importantly, policies were rewritten to prevent anything like this from happening again. Enforcement procedures were standardized. Appeals were given fixed timelines. Financial records were opened for periodic review. Transparency, which had always been talked about, was finally put into writing. The change wasn't instant, but it was real. A landscaping crew showed up one morning to restore my lawn, paid for entirely by the HOA. They replaced damaged soil, reseeded the grass, and repaired the sprinkler line Linda's SUV had crushed over and over again. Watching them work felt surreal. For so long, the lawn had been a symbol of stress and helplessness. Now it was just grass again. Elaine noticed the difference before I did. The HOA mail stopped triggering anxiety. She stopped asking what the next notice would say. She slept better. I slept better too. The house felt lighter, like a pressure we'd been living under had finally lifted. Neighbors started talking again, not in whispers, not cautiously, real conversations. People waved. Some apologized quietly for not speaking up sooner. I didn't hold it against them. Fear has a way of isolating people, and breaking that isolation takes time. Slowly, Maple Glen Estates started to feel like a neighborhood again instead of a hierarchy. The HOA wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was functional. Boring, even. And after everything that had happened, boring felt like a victory. Standing in my yard one evening, watching the new grass take hold, I realized something simple but important. The fight hadn't ended because someone lost. It ended because the truth was finally allowed to exist in the open, and once it did, everything else followed. Looking back on everything now, I realize this story was never really about outsmarting anyone. It wasn't about being clever or getting revenge. It was about patience, about understanding how power actually works. People who abuse authority don't expect resistance that looks quiet. They expect anger, confrontation, and noise, because all of that is easy to dismiss. What they don't expect is someone who simply watches, records, and waits. I never raised my voice. I never broke a rule. I never gave Linda anything she could twist into another accusation. I just stepped aside and let her keep doing what she'd always done, believing she was untouchable. In the end, it wasn't me who exposed her. It was her own behavior, repeated over and over in plain view. The moment someone realizes their actions are being documented, not emotionally, not selectively, but consistently, everything changes. Authority without accountability collapses under its own weight. Maple Glen Estates didn't become perfect overnight, but it became fairer. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Thanks for listening.